Okay, well, good morning, everybody. So we're the next installment. I think it's class 28 in Touching a City Soul. People have that book. We should be on page 141. So last class, we were talking about sort of a retranslation of the first word of the Chumash, which is defining sort of at the same time defining sort of the purpose of creation, right? That Bereshis bara Elokim, if you look at the bottom of page 140, in the beginning God created, that's usually how it's translated, but here it says that bara can be translated as revealed, like a revelation, and Elokim, which is the name of Hashem that's used in that pasuk, is the same numerical equivalent as Hateva, which is nature. And we already translated on the previous page that Bereshis stands for Bais Rashis, the two things that are first, meaning Torah and Bnei Yisrael. So that now what we're retranslating this whole pasuk to mean is the Torah and the children of Israel, which is the Bereshis, the two things that are first, who together comprise the twofold purpose of creation and implied by the word Bereshis, by the letter Bais in the word Rashis, like we did a few weeks ago. Reveal bara, they reveal Bereshis, these two firsts, bara, reveal Elokim, the nature that the Creator implanted in heaven and earth. Elokim, Eis HaShemayim Ve'Eis HaAretz. So we're retranslating Bereshis, these two firsts of creation, the Jewish people and the Torah. Bara, they reveal. Elokim, the godliness, basically, this level of godliness that is hidden in nature. Eis HaShemayim Ve'Eis HaAretz, what God put into the heaven and earth. The godliness that Hashem put into heaven and earth. So the first pasuk of the Torah, the simple meaning is translated as in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. But on a deeper level is saying that Torah and the Jewish people reveal the godliness that is hidden in the heaven and earth. Right? We're getting that? Okay. So then we're saying that this, I'm going back to this paragraph, I think, because we're in the middle of the next big paragraph, but like it's really completely connected. So I think I'm just going to reread the last few lines too. So this is the underlying reason for why which the 5 books of the Chumash are divided into weekly readings. Meaning, if the whole purpose of creation is that these two Rashises, God, the Jewish people and Torah, reveal the godliness that's hidden in the world. So, like, how does that happen? So we divide up the Chumash into a reading for every parsha. For each reading in its distinctive way vitalizes the world and all of its created entities and overtly lights up the 5 levels of the soul, the nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, and yechida. So when we read the part of the Chumash, the parsha for that week, when we read it, that's like what gives life to the world for that week, so to speak. And it also gives life to our soul. Our 5 levels of the soul, the 5 5 books of the Chumash, 5 levels of the soul. And Torah and the Jews is that Rashis, that the world was created, or that it was for the purpose of the creation of the world, reveals godliness in the heaven and earth. So it's like we're like a unit. The Jewish people in Torah are like a unit to reveal godliness in the world. So we need to read Torah every week to like activate this, So besides the fact that we have to learn Torah every day, obviously we have to learn Torah every day, and everybody here is doing a very good job at doing that today. Baruch Hashem, we're all doing it together. The idea that we're reading the parsha of the week every week is because that parsha sort of activates that week. So why are we talking about it here in the middle of this talk of the previous Rebbe? Because remember, this Sikha is starting talking about Bishalach, about the fact that it's Shabbos Shira, it's the week of Bishalach. Like he's taught. So from just a simple sort of like, oh, this is the week that it talks about Az Yashir and the Tefillah split. And then we go a little bit deeper and we say, oh, and Maharal talked about this minhag of feeding the birds and, would educate the children in the minhagim because the minhagim add this depth to Torah experience. And then he says, we're going to understand this now from a Hasidic perspective, a deeper perspective. So this is that deeper perspective, right? That it's not just that we're reading something because we want to remember about it every week for 3,000 years. We're reading about it because it's actually what gives life force to the world and helps. It's like our tool. It's like Torah's our tool and we are Torah's tool. We're like mutually tools to reveal the godliness that Hashem put in heaven and earth. So we got to connect regularly in order to do that because we're a team, right? Just simply we have to. Okay, so that's so now on the top of page 141. So Chassidus explains clearly that there's no place that is void of him does not merely mean that God is present everywhere, right? That quote that we said last week is from the Tikkunei Zohar. It doesn't just mean that Hashem is present everywhere. Beyond that, that's definitely, first of all, that by itself is a very deep idea that Hashem is everywhere, because there are schools of thought that would say otherwise, meaning that would say, God's in all the holy things, but in the unholy things, that there's no God, God forbid, or in the real physicality of the world, or something like that, right? But Kabbalah, the Arizal, explains that. So the Tikkunei Zohar is like based on the Zohar, we're talking about like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and these people, and the Arizal, the way he explains the Kabbalah is that this school of Kabbalah that Chabad Hasidus is based on the teachings of the Arizal, which says that there is no place devoid of him is quite literal, even in unholy things, even in anything at all. There's Hashem is always found, always present, and that's one reason why we need to be mindful of Hashem at all times. And there's no place without him means everything is being kept in creation and in existence because Hashem is choosing to do so. So that's by itself a whole idea by itself. But here the previous was saying that's not even the main point that I want to bring out now. Like it's not only that, but beyond that, it means that everything is Elokus, and Elokus is everything. Meaning, that's what we said, last week. We talked about like how did God create the world? There was nothing besides him. So what did he create the world from? He had to create the world from him because there was nothing else to create the world from. There is still nothing else besides God. So God still has to create the world all the time from himself, right? So just more and more and more and more and more of a condensation and contraction of Hashem with veiling and everything else. So the idea is that everything's Elokus, which is divinity, and Elokus, divinity, is everything. For there's spiritual divinity and also natural divinity, meaning there's, spiritual divinity is really easy to sort of recognize that it's godly because it's, spiritual, and people confuse spiritual and godly all the time, right? Just because something is spiritual in nature does not make it godly. There are things that are of the spirit, which could be really dark and terrible, and of the other side, that doesn't have to be godly. But here, what we're talking about is not just spiritual, we're talking about divinity, spiritual divinity and natural divinity. There's godliness that's spiritual, and there's godliness that's, found in the physical world. That's the godliness Hashem chooses to invest in the physical world. That's what keeps us here alive, As has often been explained, what people call nature, teva, is really divinity. That is, it's divinity that vests itself in all kinds of garments, which are collectively called nature. Meaning, nature does not have its own existence, just like nothing else has its own existence either, right? There's no such thing as, a law of nature. There's the way God set up the world, which is that he invested himself and he set up this whole like organized system called nature and so on and so forth. But he's not bound by nature because he created nature. So nature isn't stronger than God. I mean, that was one of the things that the 10 plagues were set out to do, was to teach the world, and especially the Egyptians who were pagan, but even the Jews who needed that lesson before we became the nation of, that was going to take this message to the world with the giving of the Torah, that the godliness, Hashem is not bound by nature and is not affected by nature, I guess you could say, meaning the plagues defied nature, right? That, it's fire and water together and one didn't extinguish the other, or things that didn't make sense were happening, not just like this, but because God said it's going to happen on this time at that, on this day at this time, and this is what's going to be the result, and then it's going to go away, and all, right? Just to show how God is he's not just the creator, but he's also involved in creation, and he's also found in creation in all of its details. So there's no such thing as like, oh, God is too big for this. He's too great for this. He doesn't have, there might be a person who we might think so-and-so is too great for this, which is not necessarily a good thing, but it's, just a thing that sometimes people feel that way. But there's nothing that God is too great for, or that is too small for God to get sort of involved with, which is something that's not readily understood or sort of even intuitive unless you really sort of meditate on that, right? God is found in the big things and in the details, right? So even the details of nature. So that's what's called teva. Nature is actually godliness that's hidden in the physical world. And even the word teva tells us that, because, as we're going to see in the next line, in the Holy Tongue, the root of that word teva, the actual word itself, which is usually translated as nature, means submerged or drowned, as in the phrase that speaks of the ancient Egyptians who were drowned in their sea of reeds, tubu b'yamsuf. We say it in davening every day. An object submerged in the sea is merely obscured and veiled by water, but in fact it remains fully existent. Similarly, divinity is submerged and hidden in the veils of nature. Right? The word that's something is called in Lashon HaKodesh in Hebrew reflects its essence and its creation, because the world was created in Hebrew. So the fact that nature is called teva means that what the second translation of it is submerged. It hints to us that there's something submerged here. That's why it's called teva. And what it is that's submerged is godliness. Godliness is hidden and submerged within nature and the laws of nature. So it looks on the outside like it's nature. We call it nature, and we call it the laws of nature because that's how we sort of have to live our lives. It's just like that's how, but we have to remember that we're calling it teva because we have to remember that really godliness is submerged in there, and everything is godliness, and godliness is everything. Some revealed, some concealed, and all this kind of differentiation, which is why some things are angels, which have more, it's more obvious that they're godly, and some things are, mud, and it's not as obvious that it's godly, right? But everything is created by God, and everything's life force and creation is brought into existence by God. And even the laws of nature, God is not bound by the laws of nature. He set up nature in this way, and at any time he wants to, he can do something different, which is what we generally call it a miracle. When we have that breakthrough godliness that sort of breaks through nature, that's usually what we call a miracle. We call that a miracle because we get to see for a moment godliness like shoot through what naturally wouldn't make sense, the way that the laws of nature have been set up. But really, godliness is everywhere, and he could do that at any time. He chose to set up the world in a way that looks like it's independent and looks like it's running according to a system, so that we'd be able to partner with Torah, like it said, like how we just translated the first word of the Chumash again, right? That Torah and the Jewish people reveal the godliness that is hidden in nature. That's right. That's how God set up the world. So he set up the world that way, but we have to remember that if we're here to reveal the godliness that's submerged and hidden in nature, we can't be the ones to forget that that's the case. We have to remember that in order to be able to effectuate our job and do our purpose in creation. So how are we doing? Any questions?
I have a question. May I ask a question?
Yeah.
I didn't quite understand what you said about spiritual, the other side, and I thought that's also, I didn't understand that.
Something that is spiritual just means that it's not connected to the physical world so much. It's less connected to the physical world.
But isn't God that too?
There is spiritual godliness, like it says, there's spiritual divinity and natural divinity. But not everything that's spiritual is necessarily godly. Just because it's not of the body doesn't mean that it's holy. There can be things that are not of the body that are very unholy.
I'm sorry, I'm just having a hard time with that matching up to en od milvado.
En od milvado means that there's nothing besides God, right? So things that are, so let me see if I can pinpoint the issue. There are things in this world, everything, even the unholy parts of this world are created by God. But just because something is created by God doesn't mean that we're supposed to connect to it or behave that way or bring that into our life.
Right.
Some things that are created by God and are sustained by God in creation are things that we are supposed to say no to. Like, for example, non-kosher meat or non-kosher meditation or hatred, or, you know, things that could be of the body or of the spirit, which could be unholy. That's the term that's used. It doesn't mean that God's not bringing it into creation. He's bringing the holy and the unholy into creation. But the holy are things that we're supposed to sort of get involved in, and the unholy are things that we are supposed to say no to. And the way that we elevate them and bring their purpose to creation is by eschewing them and not getting involved in them. So does that address what you're...
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay.
I appreciate that. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? But that idea that something can be spiritual, meaning not of the physical, but still not on the side of holiness, that's clear, right? That's a hard concept. I'm just going back to it.
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. I mean, think about like black magic or even like qualities, hatred or things like that, right? Those are things that are not of the body, but they're not godly. So just because something is not of the body does not automatically make it godly. Things that are of the body can be very godly and holy. Or let's say, you know, on the side of holiness, right? There are things of holiness and unholiness that are physical, and things that are holy and unholy that are spiritual. In English, the term spiritual sometimes gets confused with idea godly, because people maybe are uncomfortable using the word God, so they like to use the word spiritual. But that doesn't make it godly just because it's spiritual.
That was funny.
I know, I mean, I think it's true.
It's true, that's why it's funny.
Okay, good. It's a very foundational point, which sometimes gets lost. You know what I mean? Because it's not, it has to sort of be named to be recognized, I think sometimes. But I think it's an important point. You know, people, let's say, who get into hallucinogenic states because of drugs, they feel very spiritual, but that's not godly. They're not closer to God from that experience. They're more detached from the physical from that experience, but that's not a godly experience.
Right.
I'm just saying, for example, another example, right? I mean, there's like many kinds of examples like that. So we have to be careful that we really like name what we're talking about, which is why I like the way they translated this here, spiritual divinity and natural divinity, because we're not talking about something that's spiritual or something that's physical. we're talking about something that's godly and in two different states, a spiritual godliness or a physical, natural godliness. But we're talking about godliness. Our job is to reveal the godliness in the world, whether it's spiritual in nature or physical, like in other words, meaning submerged in the physicality of the world. The godliness that's submerged within the, I mean, God doesn't have a form, but the point is like the godliness that's submerged in the physical or the godliness that's submerged in the spiritual. God's not spiritual or physical, he's just God, but he enclosed himself in spirituality and in physicality. And our job is to reveal the godliness that's in the spiritual realm and reveal the godliness that's in the natural realms through Torah and mitzvahs. Does that
So
make
if
sense?
somebody, I just consider when I use the word, I just feel so en on milvado. So he's created all of it. If a non-Jew is praying to whatever they pray to, God created them and whatever they do as well. We don't partake in that. That's not godly to us. That's not part of Torah, and that's not for us. But he created them, and he created what, I don't know. Is that, can you speak on that for a second?
So I think what you're saying is, are they doing anything but with their prayer, kind of a thing? Like what's happening when they pray? So it depends, meaning idolatry is not permitted for anybody, Jew or non-Jew. So there are some forms of other worships that are not permitted even for non-Jews. But there are things that there are certain beliefs or ways that the non-Jew relates to a God that would be permitted for a non-Jew that are not permitted for a Jew, which it's like beyond the scope of this lecture, all the details of the halacha, but this concept of shutaf, which means like God has, there's some sort of a partner or something like that, is not necessarily the same for a non-Jew or a Jew, the way that they have to, worship. So it just really depends on the method that they practice with, but like, for example, in the Arab world, they believe in one God. That's not idol worship. But like, I think Hindu and, the things that actually bow down to idols and give offerings to idols and things like that. I mean, there's still practices like that in the world. That's idol worship. That's not permitted even for a non-Jew. So it just is a little more complex than a one-word answer. But yeah. I mean, going back to Abraham, he destroyed his father's idols. It wasn't permitted for anybody to worship idols, right? Like in the parsha a few weeks ago. So, okay.
So the term divinity doesn't necessarily mean godly then, because when you think of divinity, you think of godly just by the description of the word divinity.
Divinity, I think it's being used in the term, yes, of godliness. I'm talking about spiritual. The reason why it says spiritual.
Why is it called spiritual divinity then, when you said that it's not necessarily godly?
No, spiritual divinity is godly and natural divinity is godly. I'm saying something that's just spiritual is not necessarily godly.
Okay.
And that's why they're using the term. I like how they translate it here very much. That's why not that it matters that I like it, but I'm saying I think it's very well done, and it's very clear that the point is the divinity. What kind of divinity is it? Is it spiritual divinity or natural divinity? We're talking only about godliness here, either in the spiritual realms or in the natural realms. That's perfect. That's great. That's what we're all about. Is divinity.
So give an example of spiritual divinity and an example of natural divinity.
Well, I mean, spiritual divinity.
What's natural divinity?
I guess natural divinity, the way that they're explaining it here, again, it's just a term that they're using. I mean, it's not part of like a lexicon here. It's just the terminology that is being used in the Sikha. But this idea is like Hashem that's hidden in nature, right? So like the laws of nature, everything that's anything that you think about when you think about nature is natural divinity. It's not right? What people call nature is really divinity, the divinity that vests itself in nature. That's called natural divinity. So anything, the fact that you plant something and it grows is natural divinity. But we sort of, you know, for ease of language and for like not walking around saying, you know, well, God did this and God did this, we just say, oh, you know, the crops grew. We don't say God caused the crop. Maybe we should be more careful, you know, and that's why the Baal Shem Tov, I think, wanted everybody and went around and trained everybody to say, thank God, you know, Baruch Hashem, that's what he was like trying, like whatever you're saying, you know, but it's like, oh, the car started and I got to work on time, Baruch Hashem. Like, right, that was God helping you get to work today. It's not like, oh, well, you know, when I don't get to work on time, that's everything that's working is because God is allowing it to work. We tend to notice things when they don't work, but I mean, that's also one of the reasons why we say morning blessings every day, right? That we should ideally, and I'm not speaking for myself or others, I'm just saying ideally, when we say those morning brachos, the point of it is to like remember that our openings are open, our closings are closed, and we're thanking Hashem for that, because how else would a human being naturally stop to notice that? Usually we just stop to notice, God forbid, when an opening is closed and a closing is open, and we say, oh my gosh, Hashem, please help, because something's going on, right? But we're saying morning brachos every day to sort of remind ourselves that the fact that our bodies are working, that's thank God. And we want to get up in the morning and notice it, recognize it, and thank God for it. And then we have a sprach, so to speak, you know, we have a relationship with God that we talk about these things with, and then God forbid if somebody needs something because an opening is closed or a closing is open, they can go back and say, well, Hashem, look, like, let's fix this, you know, like, but there's already sort of a relationship going, right? So all of that is I would say what the Sikha is talking about, natural divinity.
And spiritual divinity would be what?
So a good question. So probably spiritual divinity is possibly more all the things that are not so much of the body, like we were talking about, right? I mean, I would guess it could either be things like, you know, davening, like a feeling of davening, meaning not the you're davening for the physical thing, but like the feeling of davening, or, you know, learning Torah, or maybe some sort of emotion of love of Hashem or awe of Hashem, or you know, those kinds of things which are not so necessarily, even though the Rambam says that person should love Hashem so much that they feel it in their physical heart, but I think that's a very high level too. I'm saying, but like more of the spiritual kinds of experiences that a person could have, the things that most people would quote unquote call naturally associate with godliness, you know, as opposed to the natural things, which I think are more the things people just sort of naturally associate with nature.
So it's not necessarily an angel.
Well, it could be that, and it could be prophecy. I mean, taking into, you know, higher levels, it could be all of that, sure. You know,
but it's also within our mitzvahs, spiritual divinity. Okay.
How about hashgacha pratis is spiritual?
Hashgacha pratis for me seems to be a crossover between the two in some sort of way.
Yeah.
It's like you see the spirituality as it all of a sudden reveals itself in nature. It's like, you know what I mean? It's sort of like a connection between these two, where we feel connected to God, and we can see it and understand it because of something physical that did or didn't happen in a certain way.
Yeah, but it's only if you recognize it.
Right.
You have to recognize it.
Right.
And that's the spiritual part.
Right. That's right. Yeah. That's right. Exactly. So any of those things that we're working on ourselves for in that way, that is like the spiritual part. And maybe other people have other examples. Does that seem clear to people? Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. So back into the text. So here we go. Chassidus, whose function, so this is like, you know, if you had a highlighter, I'd say like, you could highlight this. And I would also highlight the previous paragraph and probably paragraph before, but like Chassidus' function is to reveal the soul within everything, right? It's like Chassidus, the function of Chassidus is to reveal the soul within everything. That's telling you what the function of Chassidus is right there. Reveals the soul within nature. Right? So that's the point. The point is that we're trying to reveal the godliness that is submerged within everything. It explains that there's a natural divinity and also a spiritual divinity, and concludes with the profound concept that natural divinity, divinity is hidden in nature, is, if one may use the expression, loftier than spiritual divinity. Usually that would be not intuitive, right? It's like, well, the physical world is sort of tolerated, but this world of the spirit and ideas and all that, that's like really where it's at, right? But Chassidus says the opposite. Hashem continued the order of creation and stopped when he was finished. So until he was finished, he wasn't going to stop. So that means that this physical world is where he said, oh, now I'm finished. It wasn't like he got tired and was like, okay, I'll finish later. Like, this is where he was aiming to go because this is where he got. So if that's the case, then that means that the purpose of creation is to work with the physical world. Otherwise, why would it be here? If he just wanted us to be souls without bodies, which is spiritual divinity, we could have stopped creation at that point. And then we'd just be souls in heaven, learning Torah all day, basking in the radiance of Hashem, with the angels singing on the side or something like that, you know? But doesn't sound too bad. But that's not what God wanted. Because if he wanted it, he would have just ended there. But he continued the order of creation down, 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 down until he came here and we were created. So this is the purpose of creation. So that means that the ultimate purpose of creation is to work with this level and reveal the godliness in it. And it just is explaining really in Tanya, these days of Tanya, that really when we do a mitzvah, that means we have to do something in the physical world, because right, souls can't do mitzvahs, angels can't do mitzvahs, only body and soul can do mitzvahs. So when we do a mitzvah, we're actually in a certain way closer to Hashem than when we learn Torah. Because how well do we understand the Torah that we're learning after all? We understand whatever we understand. But compared to how much there is to understand or how deeply it could be understood, how much do we understand? But when we do a mitzvah and we put a mezuzah on our doorpost or we kasher our kitchen or whatever it is that we're doing, we did it. I'm saying we just did it. We put on a mezuzah on our doorpost. We just put a mezuzah on our doorpost. We did it. That's what we had to do and we did it. And that's what God wanted us to do. And he asked us to do it and we did it. So that's a piece of godliness that we sort of connected to in the physical world completely because we just did the whole mitzvah.
But that's part of the gift of Torah, is that we have the truth, we have it, we have direction from God to get closer to him.
Yep.
To advance the world the way he intended. Otherwise, we wouldn't even know what to do.
Yep.
So that's why the action it's a clear, like, I'm going to give it to you simply because this is all you can really truly get for now. So do this definitely and keep trying on the understanding the other. No?
Yeah, exactly. Learning Torah is also a mitzvah. One of the mitzvahs that we're supposed to do is learn Torah. Okay, so that's the end of that section. So that's when the previous Rebbe said, so now we have to understand what Shabbos Shira signifies in the light of Chassidus. He just didn't talk only about what Shabbos Shira signifies in Chassidus. He talked about like what the idea of reading the Torah on Shabbos, you know, the whole message of reading Torah is, right? Like weekly portions, bringing light into the world, the connection between the Jew and the Torah, the 5 lights of the 5 levels of the soul, right? That's what this idea of not just Shabbos Shira, but like all of Torah reading, basically. So now he talked about sort of like what the Torah does, like what it accomplishes in a certain way, right? Like where we have to read the Torah, it lights up the world, it brings the creative energy to the world, it lights up the 5 levels of the soul, it helps us to like reveal the submerged godliness. Now he's going to talk a little bit about the soul, because we said the Torah was one of the first and the soul is one of the first. So we have to talk a little bit about the soul. So
Chaya, do you think, excuse me, that's why the Rebbe instituted the Chitas, where everyone should read the daily portion of Chumash with Rashi? I mean, that's like forcing every Jew to participate in doing the weekly portion.
I'm sure it's connected at some level. It
Amazing
didn't.
thought. The whole paragraph read is like crazy amazing about vitalizing the world,
yeah.
and
Pretty
the soul. Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing. I agree. Yes.
But when you do Chitas, you're actually really participating in that.
Correct. That is true. Yeah, 100%. Okay, so now let's find out about the soul. Like, what's the soul? What's the soul's part in this? So the soul of man is a candle of God. That's obviously a parable. It's from the book of Mishlei, which means parables, so makes sense that it's a parable, right? Regarding that metaphor, the Alter Rebbe writes in chapter 19 of Tanya that the flame of a candle is drawn towards its source. So you look at the footnote, it says with which it seeks to unite. And this is explained in Lessons in Time, chapter 19, right? So like the source of the flame of the candle is above it. So the flame of the candle is like if you look at a flame, it's sort of jumping off. It looks like it's jumping off the wick. It wants to leave the wick. And the Alter Rebbe explains, it wants to leave the wick, wants to like connect with the source of fire in the spiritual realms. Even though by doing that, its light will be extinguished down here. Like if it jumps off the wick, it has nothing to hold on to, it won't be a fire anymore. But it will have gone back to its source in the spiritual realms of fire. So it's drawn towards its source, even though it will be extinguished and will no longer diffuse light. Moreover, when it reaches that source, that spiritual source for fire, its identity as a luminary will utterly cease to exist, right? It won't shed any light anymore. Yet, nevertheless, this is what it desires by nature. This too is the nature of the soul, just like the light of that candle, which is drawn to its source in the universal element of fire, which is in the sublunar sphere. That's what the Tanya says where it wants to go. Here so that's one of the reasons why the flame of a candle is compared to a soul, because the same way that the flame of a candle wants to jump back to its source, so too the soul really yearns to go back and be one with Hashem. A fire, and we've talked about this in other contexts, but fire is the only thing in the physical world which defies gravity. You know, everything else, so it's the most spiritual of all creation. It's part of creation. It's a physical thing. Unfortunately, we know, right? It can destroy, it can also build, it can heat, it can warm, it can cook. I mean, it has very physical effects in the world. And yet it has the greatest spiritual elements to it. It defies gravity. It's the only thing in the physical world that actually defies gravity. If you try to contain it, it goes out. You can't like hold it, even though you can hold everything else in the physical. You can somehow, I mean, even gases, you can contain them. Maybe not as easily with, you know, your physical hands and physical eyes, but if fire, you can't contain. It goes out if you try to contain it. So the soul is compared to fire because the soul also sort of goes up. Well, it yearns to go up. Okay, so so here we see that the word nature is a borrowed term for anything concerning which there's no explanation as to why it is as it is. So that's also explained in Tanya, that sometimes something is called the nature of something, means it's inexplicable. That's just how it is. We can't explain it, so we call it the nature. You know, that's the nature of fire. Why is fire that way? We don't know. That's why we just call it its nature. In other words, we know that it is the nature of the candle, the light of the candle, as is also the case with the nature of other entities, but why this is its nature, that we do not know. You know, we could describe it, but we can't explain why. And in fact, the scope of the natural sciences, listen to what the previous Rebbe says about science. In fact, the scope of the natural sciences that relate to all the various levels of created entities, mineral, vegetative, animal, human, everything, not just fire, is restricted to knowing that such and such is the case. How are they compounded and diversified? And what are the distinctive characteristics that the Creator imbued in each of them? As to why each of them has its particular nature, this the natural sciences do not know. So the how and the what is the realm of the natural sciences. The why is completely beyond science. That's already getting into the realm of creation and God and everything else, the purpose of creation and everything else. But the how and the what, that's something that natural science can help us with. How this works, what's happening, this, what's that, you know, and then medicine and operations and, you know, things like that can help to save lives and can help direct things and create, you know, set up houses with electricity and indoor plumbing and all this kind of stuff, the how and the what. But the why is, you know, why do people need to breathe in order to keep the body and soul together? Science can't tell you why, it could just tell you that it's necessary. And if a person, God forbid, you know, suffocates and doesn't have any air, they're going to die. But they can't tell you why. They just tell you what happens when a person breathes, you know, how it works, the mechanics, basically. The Alter Rebbe is telling us that the nature of the soul resembles the nature of the light of the candle. The nature of the soul cannot be explained rationally because it soars above the heights of rational explanation, which is finite. So now getting into some Kabbalah here. The source of the soul's nature is its faculty of Khafma, the receptor for the light of Ein Sof, which is infinite. So that's sort of like a definition that we have to unpack a little bit, right? I'm just going to reread it. The source of the soul's nature, the nature of the soul, we said, is also to go upward the same way that the nature of fire. But the source of the soul's nature is its faculty of Khafma, which is the receptor for the Ein Sof light, which is infinite. So we say that every soul is a piece of God that is comprised of 10 soul powers, which are known also as the spheros, right? The way that Hashem created the world is through the 10 spheros, these 10 aspects, characteristics that Hashem chose to funnel his energy through them as vessels, right? The light of Hashem is one, unified, indistinguishable, undividable, but he chose to sort of shine his light through these 10 characters, like almost like, you know, that we've used a parable before of a light, like a traffic light. You know, it's not really a red light or a yellow light or a green light. It's really a white light that's being shown through a red glass or a yellow glass or a green glass. Sorry to break anybody's bubble if they actually thought it was red, yellow, or green lights. Or example is, you know, like colored water, light through colored water, or something like that. So one indispensable, Hashem uses these as vessels, these different kinds of, now there's lights and vessels within the sphere, it's just like a whole different class. But the idea is that every soul also has these 10 powers, the same way that Hashem created the world through these 10 characteristics. Every soul has these 10 characteristics. That's on a microcosm versus a macrocosm level. And the first of the 10 is Khafma. Khafma is usually translated as wisdom. It's the literal translation of Khafma. The word Khafma is Kayachma. You divide the word into two, which means the potentiality of something. It's the beginning of the potentiality of creation, basically. So that's the first point of definition of the soul. And it is a vessel to contain the light that comes above it, which is being called here the Or Ein Sof, which is the infinite light of Hashem. Like the vessel, the vehicle to receive the infinite light of Hashem is this first quality of the soul, which is Khafma, which is the idea in Torah, just on like a practical level, is idea in Torah, for example, that in order to learn something, right, wisdom, in order to become wise, it's not that you have to know a lot. That's not the point, right? You have to be a vessel to receive from others. It says in Perkei Avos, it says, who is wise? One who learns from everybody. It doesn't say who's wise, somebody who knows a lot, right? That's not called wisdom. That's called knowledge, but that's not called wisdom. For a person to develop Khafma, which is the potentiality for something, they have to be open to receiving, so that there's more and more potential. Potential has a open quality to it, right? So ultimately, what Khafma is receiving, what the Khafma of the soul is receiving, is the light from Ein Sof, is the light of godliness that's being shined into the soul to help it receive the godly light it needs. So the source of the soul's nature is its faculty of Khafma, the receptor for the Ein Sof light, which is infinite. With that brief statement, that nature derives from the soul's faculty of Khafma. The Alter Rebbe throws light on the entire concept of nature and endows it with its due status. So basically, we're saying, what is the nature of the soul? The nature of the soul is that it wants to go upward to its source. Its nature is set by its first faculty, which is Khafma, which wants to connect to the Ein Sof, which is the source above it. So it wants to be connected to its source above it, which is the light of Ein Sof. That's what the nature of the soul wants to do, which is why it's compared to a candle, because a candle, if you just physically look at it, it looks like it wants to jump off the wick and go back to its source in the heavenly realms. So that's sort of like the nature of the soul. Also is yearning upward to be connected to Ein Sof, which is its source, right? The light of Ein Sof is shined into the neshama through the first faculty of the neshama, which is Khafma. It also wants to go back and be united with its source. So we talked a little bit about what Torah is. We're talking a little bit about the soul is. Now, it's just a parable, and it's just, talking in general terms. It's not exactly what the soul is. It's just talking about the soul, and it's, how it's similar to a candle, why the candle is being compared to it. Because now the Friedrich was going to talk about the way that Torah talks about things, in a way that we can understand, but it's not necessarily exactly how it is in reality. It's what we can, it's a parables, in words of parables, so that we can understand something. We can't understand it in its entirety, but we're going to try to understand it, because Torah is going to give us the language to talk about these things, which are not so simple or straightforward in the way that we talk about them, or in general.
Chaya,
Yeah.
I don't understand that sentence with that brief statement that nature derives from the soul's faculty of Khafma. It sounds like the soul is the source of nature of the world. It's just language-wise, I'm not quite sure what that means.
No, that nature of the soul, meaning If you
The
look,
nature, if it's the nature of the soul, that makes more sense.
yeah, like see in the beginning of the paragraph, the Alter is telling us the nature of the soul resembles the nature of the light of the candle. The nature of the soul can't be explained rationally. So here the Alter, it's the same way that we said on the page before, that the word nature is used for anything that can't be explained why it's that way, but it's just that way. So it's like almost like an excuse. It's a word that's used in an excuse. Oh, well, this is how it is. So it's the nature of this person, the nature of the soul, the nature of fire, like that. Not talking about like nature as in teva or creation. The word in Hebrew, right? That's its nature. We have no explanation for it. That's its nature. Even we use that for the natural world too, for nature of creation too, right? We have no explanation for why. What we don't know why. We just know that God wanted it this way. That's the why, but we don't know exactly what. We don't know all the details of the why, right? Just that God wanted it that way. So we call something nature when we see that that's how it is. So we just call it the nature of something. The nature of the sun is to rise and set. The nature of the soul is similar to the nature of fire, that it wants to go up. But the fact that the Alter Rebbe says that the nature of the soul derives from the soul's faculty of Khafma, so then the Alter Rebbe throws light on the entire concept of nature and endows it with its true status, meaning it makes it, that idea, more important almost, because he's talking about the nature of the soul. So that means like this is an important concept to understand, that this is the way something is also, even though it's a borrowed term, and it's not exactly the exact definition of something, but it still has some importance that we are going to be discussing it. Because he talks about how the nature of the soul, meaning its personality or something like, just the way it is, derives from Khafma, which is the receptor for the Ein Sof, which is the infinite light of Hashem, which is an important stuff to talk about. It's important to understand that. Not talking about nature like creation, talking about the nature of the soul right now.
Thank
you. Okay.
This is referring to the soul within the human.
The godly soul.
The godly soul. So when we talk about refining our nature, is this the piece that we're refining, or this is the piece we cannot refine?
We refine our animal soul.
To be more, to reach higher
godly.
Towards the nature soul.
To reach more towards the godly soul.
Towards this godly soul we're talking about.
Right.
Okay.
Because Jews have a godly soul, and it's usually called an animal soul or an animating soul. We have both a godly soul and an animal soul, animating soul. So we're trying to refine our animal soul.
To so that's the candle part, we're trying to reach up.
No, this is talking about the godly soul wanting to reconnect. The godly soul to reconnect to God himself and not have to be the body. So he doesn't go through the whole parable, but in the Tanya he talks about how, so the body is like the wick of the flame. The body keeps the way that the wick holds on to the flame and keeps it in the physical world. The body holds on to the neshama and keeps it in the physical world. In the same way that the flame wants to jump off the wick and go back to its source, the flame, the soul wants to sort of jump out of the body and be reunited with God. That's the godly soul. The animal soul, I'm not sure that that's exactly what it wants. Maybe on a very deep level, that's what it wants. But the godly soul, right there on the surface, it wants to be part of God again. Even though once it leaves the body and goes back to its source in God, it also ceases to be a light in the physical world. And it also ceases to be able to do mitzvahs, the same way that the flame ceases to burn. But it really wants to do that. But however, God doesn't want it to do that, so it gives up its own desire for God's desire, and it stays in the physical world, and it, resigns itself to being here. But its inner desire is to jump out of the body and be connected with Hashem.
Chaya, are you talking about the animal soul
The godly soul,
right now?
the godly soul.
But what happens to the animal soul when the godly soul returns to Hashem?
You're saying it also returns to Hashem. Everything returns to Hashem. But the animal soul, by its nature, is more self-centered. The godly soul, by its nature, is God-centered.
It's like they have two different jobs.
Well, they have two different perspectives, and we spend our life having our godly soul try to convince our animal soul to do what it wants and to refine itself. It's not bad, it's just it's a little self-obsessed. Well, not necessarily wants to do bad things, but it doesn't necessarily want to do godly things either. It just sort of wants to have fun.
So, but we need our animal soul, animating soul, in order to accomplish things here in this world. Is that
Yeah.
what that's about? I mean,
Yeah.
otherwise, why would
Yes.
we just have?
Our animal soul, our godly soul needs the animal soul. The animal soul is completely vested in the body, keeping the body alive and so on. So they have to make a working relation. They have to make a partnership.
So can I take a stab at answering Debbie's question about what happens to the animal soul when it goes back to Hashem? Maybe the answer to that is that there's no need anymore for that bifurcation of the two types of souls. Once the soul is actually back in Shemayim with Hashem, the animal soul needs to, it basically comes into play out of necessity only when it's down here in the physical world. So what happens to the animal soul when it goes back to Hashem? It probably folds back into the spiritual soul and becomes one again, only to be re-separated, if Hashem decides to send that soul back to the physical world again. Does that make any sense at all?
That's yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
Interesting.
It's like it gives me a better picture. Thanks.
Yeah.
So when people do bad things, like genuinely bad things, does that partly mean that they're just ignoring their other soul and just giving in to their animal soul because doing those bad things feels so good?
Well, basically, that's what the Yetzer Hara is, right? The Yetzer Hara is the emotional component of the animal soul. It does what it wants to do. So sometimes the godly soul can convince it out, and sometimes it doesn't convince it out.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I think we need to end class now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chaya.
Have a
Can we
wonderful-
go over this again on Monday?